Только, блядь, она легла, блядь, бросил уже там раз, педаль нахуй поворотом, блядь.
Hi, my name is Alex.
And my name is Jericho.
And today we're going to be comparing George Orwell's Animal Farm to events in the Russian Revolution. But before we go any further, I think some definitions are in order. The Russian Revolution describes the rise of communism through revolution and its following manipulation during the Stalinist era. Animal Farm is an allegory for this period in history, from 1917 to 1943.
Колесным, блядь, сука, блядь.
But the novel is more than a satire of the revolution. It depicts the real-life political and social interactions in the rise of Soviet Russia. We're going to break down these complex interactions into 3 topics, all of which correspond to events or overarching themes in the book. The first topic is the spread of communism and how Stalin changed Marx's version of communism to suit his agenda. Karl Marx was a German philosopher who created the idea of Marxism, that economic activity should be regulated completely by the state. Marx was important, therefore, because he laid the groundwork for the economic practice Russia would adopt for the next century, and spread it in his 2 books, Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. Remember that all this happened much before the actual revolution. It was a Marxist named Vladimir Lenin who sided with the Bolsheviks in 1817 who directly called for the revolution.
So in the story, Orwell gives Major as a mix of both. He was like Marx in that he gave the basic tenets of animalism. He says, no animal must ever live in a house, or sleep in a bed, or wear clothes, or drink alcohol, or smoke tobacco, or touch money, or engage in trade. But he was also like Lenin in that he directly called for revolution. When Major addresses the animals in the first chapter, he exclaims, "That is my message to you, comrades. Rebellion."
But contrasting the optimistic beginnings of communism, Stalin's version was much more cruel and realistic. After winning a power struggle against Trotsky in 1927, he quickly implemented his command economy, collectivized farmland, and forced the development of heavy industry. But he didn't stop there. Stalin purged the Soviet government by torturing those who he considered enemies of the state, until they admitted to crimes they had not committed. Then he had them killed.
We see the same type of abuse of power and paranoia in Napoleon. The most severe example of this is when he kills a group of hens and pigs guilty of apparently working with Snowball. Napoleon now called upon them to confess to the crimes. Without any further prompting, they confessed that they had been secretly in touch with Snowball ever since his expulsion. When they had finished their confession, the dogs promptly tore their throats out. Here, Napoleon forces the accused to confess to the crimes they did not commit, and they agreed because they lacked the power to oppose him.
So the next connection between the book and the revolution is how Stalin, again represented by Napoleon in Animal Farm, used propaganda to manipulate public opinion. During his reign, Stalin used a secret police force called the NKVD, the Soviet newspaper called the Pravda, or his propaganda minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, as vehicles of propaganda. He used the NKVD to remove political opponents and any threat to his power, and the Pravda alone to give a partial reading of events.
Likewise, the book focuses on 2 methods of propaganda: intimidation and censorship. Napoleon's dogs serve as a symbol of intimidation. He uses them to exterminate any opposing forces that threaten his position as a leader. In terms of censorship, Napoleon ensured the animals were kept uneducated, so as to never question his decisions or their current state. He used Squealer to repaint the laws, so his actions would always fall under them. We see this when some animals begin to remember that one of the rules might have been that no animal should kill another animal. Squealer changed the rule to no animal should kill another animal without reason to justify Napoleon's actions. Orwell is especially clever when he uses Squealer as an example of a political leader who uses rhetoric and difficult language to confuse the masses into believing an idea. As he outlined in Politics and the English at Last, the most clear example of Napoleon's censorship is his training of the sheep to bleat. Whenever the animals begin to question his words, he literally censors their thoughts with the sheep.
And the last connection that we're going to make is Boxer's death. His death is an allegory for Stalin's betrayal of the principles of the rebellion. Stalin's reign was marked by the exploitation of the proletariat, an ideal opposite to that of Marxism. Instead of establishing a dictatorship of the proletariat, Stalin worked to elevate the power of the state and decrease the power of the worker. Economically, Stalin forced the 5-year plan down their throats and called for compulsory labor and no economic initiative. Socially, Stalin employed techniques like propaganda and public executions in order to discourage dissent. But in terms of political relations, Stalin isolated Russia from the rest of the world with his socialism in one country, as opposed to Marx's idea of global communism. This same betrayal is best represented by Boxer's death. He represents a perfect proletarian worker. He never complains, is highly loyal, and works tirelessly. When he is injured, he is rewarded by being sold, slaughtered, and turned into glue. At this point, Orwell makes it clear to the audience that Napoleon has completely denounced the idea of old Major in favor of his own radical agenda.
In addition, Boxer can be seen as a symbol of hope and admiration for the people. During the winter, when most animals lost morale, they looked to Boxer. But the other animals found more inspiration in Boxer's strength and his never-falling cry of, "I will work harder." When Boxer died, so too did the animals hope for the promised outcomes of the rebellion. Instead of a particular event in the Russian history, Orwell presents Boxer's death as a symbol of Stalinism as a whole, betraying the very workers it was supposed to help.
That was a lot of information to process in one go, so here's a quick recap. First, we talked about the spread of communism and how Stalin changed Marx's vision of it to suit his agenda. In the book, we learned that Major was a mix of Marx and Lenin, as he started the idea of animalism. Later in the story, Napoleon takes over and turns animalism on its head.
Next, we talk about the propaganda methods Stalin used, represented by Napoleon in animal form. He used propaganda to sway public opinion. In the book, Napoleon uses Squealer, his dogs, and the sheep to intimidate and censor the other animals. And last, we talk about how Boxer's death was an allegory for Stalin's hypocrisy and betrayal of the principles of Marxism.
But the meaning of Animal Farm goes beyond a history lesson on the Russian Revolution. First, it teaches us that those in power are suspect to abusing their authority. It is up to societies to create limitations so that power cannot overcome the voice of the people. It also teaches the value of individual voices and how these are strengthened with education. The novel warns against ignorance and finally encourages us to continually question authority to prevent abuse of power.
Ну прекращение! У тебя уже задняя скорость включена, как ты только, блядь, сам нахуй!